Hello everyone, today I would like to come back on Carolingian history and discuss the very birth and origins too of the feudal system, or the so-called Vassallatic-Beneficiary system into Carolingian Europe, and more specifically in Carolingian Francia. And trying to make also a bit of a comparison with other societies aside from the one of Gaul. Actually, there were more Gallic societies. Thinking about southern Gaul was radically different from the north. But also an interesting comparison is between Frankish Gaul and Longobarд Italy. As we know, I haven't still discussed in detail about this, but I will have to do it sooner or later. The Vassallatic beneficiary system is something that we say it's being, at least conventionally, to have been created by the early Carolingians, more specifically Charles Martel, that definitely had a very great role into this. He especially really fastened that up. But telling the truth, as we will be seeing, the Vassallatic beneficiary system in many forms, even in terms of the actual sanction from a ritual point of view, were something that really already belonged to Frankish society, and we can say early medieval society as a whole. Especially there would be a few exceptions into which to this, in the sense that eventually this clientery system made it to become institutional in the world of the Carolingians. Certain things didn't happen into the Byzantine Empire or in the Islamic caliphates, because those were more centralized states with a centralized bureaucracy and administration. Although those were still a clientery society, you can argue that even today we have clientelism in some measure. You have to think in early medieval times that was the norm. And what really the Franks did, the Carolingians did at this point, at the beginning of the 8th century, was practically a new juridical formalization of the clientery relations, especially at a military level, which was basically the one to which the Franks were the most advanced, we can say, at the time, not because other peoples didn't know how to fight, but because the development of the Vassallatic beneficiary system and eventually feudalism was originally aimed practically almost to provide a substantial amount of troops, especially professional troops, that were in this sense really created by the Carolingians, because in tribal society you don't really have a professional fighter, or at least there are several of these fighters that eventually can and definitely spend their war life fighting, and therefore being professional in it in a certain fashion, but that lack that necessary collective training that makes of big armies a professional system, at least in their core, in the sense that Carolingian armies were gravitating around this core of heavy cavalry, and then there would be as well those average tribal levies that existed into the Germanic world. But really the greatest thing the Carolingians did was indeed create this new military elite through a system that therefore saw the inflation of the clientelar system, and in this sense of all its advantages and disadvantages. We will see how this happened. So we can say that parts of the clientelar system that existed into Carolingian times, as I was saying before, already largely existed in many forms, also in the Frankish, in previous Gallic society. The so-called commendatio was something we can trace back to the Roman Gaul. And it practically consisted into really bilateral relations between certain powerful people. We can't say, that there is a specific institutional role, also because this was largely happening at a private level, and also because the society at that point, the Roman state had collapsed, and when the Franks arrived, they, especially the Merovingians, considered the whole all what they had gotten with very ferocious ways as well, not much towards the populations but towards the rest of the Frankish aristocracy, basically belonged to them and was seen and conceived as substantially a private dominion. So if that was what the big guys were doing at the top, you can imagine how the rest of this society was, and this was increased especially by the fragmentation of the Merovingian Empire. You know that by the end of the 7th century there is not a Frankish Empire anymore. It's like basically four small Frankish kingdoms fighting against each other and then interacting with the other political bodies that the Franks had subjugated, like the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Aquitanians, etc., that were also being influenced by Frankish political culture and developing a deep, really in this more external world, in this decentralized world from the Francia proper, a privatization of power. And it was a relation, as I was saying, the commendatio, between singular powerful people and single men of usually weak socio-economical condition that basically asked to this powerful man that became essentially their patron protection. And to whom they also offered services in turn, so therefore commending themselves into his hands, into their master's hand. So this was kind of obvious. It still existed partly. This was already something. The commendatio was a bit different from the ancient Roman clienteles, but essentially, just in its form, it had been partly Germanized, partly was the Gallo-Roman society that had developed this, and Gaul had a kind of privileged, let's say that it had quite effective preconditions for this from this system to develop, essentially because in Gaul, as I said many times in my videos, in early medieval Gaul, there had not been, like in other areas of Europe, a kind of destruction of late antique socio-economical structures. Gaul had passed relatively untouched from the hands of the Romans to the one of the Franks, and this had allowed the latter to inherit all the administrative system that existed in Gaul at that time, and especially these great latifundia, these very large estates that, albeit declining, because obviously there was a decline also in Gaul, as generally into the whole Eurasia, at least at this time, in economical terms, well, they were still pretty much intact estates. So what the Franks did was basically to seize them individually as private properties, and therefore already having a very few people in society that owned the largest majority of properties. In this sense, there was also a mass of other people that became their clients essentially, and that had to work for them. And we're talking this happened both for the Germanic, and the Latin aristocracies. Then eventually they got intermingled, so it was something pretty transversal. It's not that it happened because of the Franks or the Romans. It was something that they both, the Romans obviously had created it. Gaul was extremely wealthy also in pre-Roman times and all. But Roman society was largely this made up by latifundia, and the Franks were quite happy to take them. So the very great feudal estates of the low Middle Ages in France are actually sometimes the direct descendants of these Roman estates existing in Gaul, and especially into the area into which the Franks had settled, which by the way had also remained depopulated. So maybe it was in a certain sense even easier to seize them, in the sense that Belgic Gaul, which was essentially the one into which the Franks settled, was more easily seized without having too strong compromises with other local aristocracies that, however, did exist and were especially of senatorial origin. But now we're going a bit astray from our main point. Maybe at this point it's useful to draw the comparison with Italy, because in Italy the Longobards that eventually got conquered by the Franks, so they even were transformed in this sense into a sort of Frankish, definitely in a Frankish kingdom, even though with certain differences unavoidably. We're developing something, we can't say similar because really it's too misleading. It was quite different, but it's still comparable as a form of clientelism, and it has to do with the so-called Gazindi. Now, what were the Gazindi? Well, actually Gazindius and Vassus. The Vassus was essentially what would have become the vassal in Frankish world, where they actually had the same linguistical root, by the way, and the Gazindi in the Longobards kingdom were, and this is really the greatest difference, they were relatively modest people from a socio-economical point of view. They were kind of similar to the ancient Roman clients, essentially. So there were people who had a kind of rooting into society that control other people, and that were emerging as a reference for the royal authority. The Longobards, and a few people know this, actually had built at that point the most civilly advanced Romano-Germanic kingdom at the time, who still thinks that they were kind of bloodthirsty and primitive barbarians, should really look and study a bit of history more. And they had managed to already create a sort of public centralized system with the Gastaldi, that were really public officers sent from the central government to control the various Longobard duchies. And the Gazindi in this sense were, however, and these were typical of the later Longobard society, which was seeing a progressive social stratification in many ways, were kind of the guys at the top, not really from a military point of view. I mean, surely the Gazindi had military retinues with them, but they were private retinues, and it was normal for every powerful person to have armed retinues in that time. But these were figures that had gained somehow perhaps even through an armed service of some sort, a favor at court, the Longbard under the Longbard king, and that therefore were these kind of men of trust of the royal of the Longbard kings into the various, especially in the various cities, because the Gazindi weren't landed owners at all. I mean, yeah, let's not generalize. Yes, they were also landowners, but they weren't principally landowners. They were especially prominent figures into cities, extremely different from the Frankish Vassi instead, that initially were something similar to the Gazindi, but during the development of the Vassallatic-Beneficiary system became practically the military aristocracy, and therefore people who had huge estates that were sometimes even greater than the one of the Longbard king, who had these private properties as well. So you can here it gives, well, the sheer quantitative difference of land owning between Gaul and Italy. The Italians were the wealthiest people in the world pro capita at that time, but Gaul was richer in absolute terms, and the aristocracy was extremely rich, while the rest of the people was not so well off, like in the Longbard kingdom. So obviously it was still pretty miserable life, but it's still important to see how eventually when the Franks invaded Italy, they basically transformed Longbard society into something much more closer to the Frankish one, with a few guys, enormously wealthy guys at the top, who became eventually like counts and marquises and very prominent figures that eventually fought for gaining, even seizing the crown, and which had not happened into Longbard Italy at all, and that therefore could and had to provide a military service to the king, something that Gazindi could do, but in a really slightly a much lesser way. And in this sense, if you see even in video games, I don't know, it's plenty of stuff like that out there, to which you see the Gazindi like this elite unit of the Longbard army, because it's being said this historiographically as well. It's really false. Seemingly they had very few to do with military business, even if they could provide it, but definitely they weren't the professional military elite that you could find instead in the Frankish Vassi, that were something completely different. And because what the Franks were doing, nobody was not even coming close to achieve in the rest of Europe. And that's really what made the Carolingian Empire, materially speaking, because that elite eventually conquered the same empire. So so through the commendatio that we have seen pre-existing Carolingian times, the same Carolingians increased the vassalatic clienteles enormously in their process of reconstruction of the Frankish Empire, therefore putting an end to this chronic division of the territories that once had belonged to Clovis, and that they weren't really completely able to do, in the sense that as long as the military machine of the Franks worked, as long as expansion and new people to raid, new properties to seize could be obtained, this system kind of went on fairly well, in spite of the chronicle division of at every generation into equal parts of the father's property to one of his sons, which created probably the greatest obstacle to the Carolingians in absolute terms. Like if Charlemagne's brother had not died, making Charles he is the only Frankish king, we would have simply not had a Carolingian Empire, or at least we would have had it, but something extremely small, or even coming back to the chaos of Merovingian times. So we have basically the Carolingian Empire because Charles the Great and Louis the Pious remained the only surviving sons of their respective fathers. So this tells much about the weakness and of the dynastic concept and the private conception of what would have had to be theoretically public. But and the Franks never bought that. I mean, while the Longobards had pretty clear in mind that the Longobard kingdom belonged to the Longobards and it was an elective monarchy which worked as such, the Franks always conceived that, I mean, those at the top had to command everyone if they had the strength, and this caused some of the worst bloodsheds even. I mean, I'm not criticizing this from a moral point of view, but if the Franks had found out a better succession system, at least for even for a ruling dynasty, they could have achieved much more than what they achieved, which was already pretty impressive the way it was. But it was also pretty lucky that they reached up to that point. So, as you know, basically, as long as the Carolingians expanded, and with the successful military operations fueled by the Vassallatic system, the clienteles became increasingly larger. So this produced really the base of what would have been eventually the Frankish nobility. Frankish meant as Western, Central and Western European nobility. So in all the areas to which the Carolingian Empire had spread, and that eventually became to conquer England and southern Italy, and therefore by the 12th or at least 13th century being the hegemonic political, social, military system that of Europe in practice. And even in the East, think about when the Byzantine Empire was conquered by the French, or even in the Near East with the Crusader states. There were obviously major differences between these entities, but they all came from they all came to be ruled by a feudal system. That was what the Carolingians set up, and that was probably the longest lasting achievement of the Carolingians themselves, that at a certain point didn't help themselves because it on the contrary contributed to crush them, but that remained as the ancien regime until the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. It was the political reality of Europe. And there are also, of course, military characters to the previous to the pre-Carolingian clientelism. For instance, in the Merovingian times, the members of the Trustis Regia, they were literally the trustees of the kings, were normally swearing an oath of military fealty, or at the time, towards their masters, the Merovingians in that sense, and this definitely happened also at a lower level in the social ladder with all this huge amount of patterns that existed and with their clients. And the ceremony with which this tie basically was established was a pretty solemn one. It's the one that eventually has been has come to the glories of chivalric literature. The so-called the mixtio manum, which means literally the mission of the hands, into which the Vassus placed his own hand into one of his senior, so his master, and by and eventually pronouncing the ritual words of submission. Mm? What in French in later centuries would have been called the homage. Mm? And so this is something that really happened in many forms in all clienteling societies. I mean, even the same. This was something a bit more contractual than else, because it implied that both sides had to be faithful to one another. It wasn't just the master that had to be revered by the vassals. It was also the master who had in turn provide that protection that the vassals was seeking, for which in turn he would have got the vassals services. And but in all clienteling societies, you have this kind of recognition of respect in some ways, and therefore it is bonds that form to eventually structure society and glue as a gluing factor, and in a certain sense, and eventually when this became a fully Christian world, this was obviously also an oath that was taken over the Bible. Mm? So the and you don't have. I mean, when we discuss about the Carolingian times, there is this kind of undeletable stigma of the private nature of these bonds that really couldn't really hold, and you see that in the way that the Carolingian Empire crumbled, basically, because fealty is it's just a word sometimes. However, this doesn't have to be underestimated either. The fact that so much emphasis was placed on this ceremony of the Mixtio Manum is definitely obviously stressing publicly, because this was a public ceremony. The the idea that there had been a pact that had been contracted. You know, at the time, this was the average in those societies. It was, instead of signing a document, there was a public ritual. This was typical of many other societies at the time, and it had a legal value. Mm? Hence, it had to be public to be recognized by witnesses. But it was really a matter of, it was very important in these societies, especially those who came from a more strictly Germanic origin. The Carolingians, by the way, emerged from the Eastern Francia, was pretty much Germanized in this sense. They were militarized societies that, you know, not really respecting your word is like being a worthless person in front of the whole society. And naturally, we know that the practice of politics already at that time was depressingly hypocritical in this sense, because there were constant rebellions and all. But the social significance of having a sworn loyalty, fealty, and even over a holy scripture, it was something really important. I mean, it had a legal value. I mean, if the two contractors of this pact, if one of those at least came to disrespect this agreement, to break it, it was seen like a legally a legitimate action to eventually, I don't know, waging war against this rebel Vassus. Because it was evident that he had disobeyed, he had not, and those societies relied so heavily on such oaths, essentially because there were not very, there weren't centralized states that could really impose effectively the obedience of those agreements. But it was theoretically society to take that place and to let people being ashamed of breaking a pact. in those circumstances. So this is the real meaning of such ceremonies. So it was this bond was really felt as a very personal and morally demanding duty. It was like a juridically sanctioned friendship. Um, and the theory was that the Vassus basically became sort of I can't say a relative, but definitely a familiar person with his master. You have to think that, especially in this military context of Carolingian Europe, what was evident was essentially that these guys had to fight with them. I mean, they had to. The Vassi were those who fought alongside their master into battle. So there were even people who had into which the senior had to put his own trust. So there were really people who needed to be faithful, in the sense that to have a discipline and to have um, and to have let's say and of course also the Vassi in this sense had placed their fortune by betting on that senior. I mean, it was something very profitable to become the Vassus of a very powerful senior, because you could really improve your social conditions to become very rich. By the way, the Carolingian in their rise really changed something in terms of the social, in terms of bringing new forces into Frankish aristocracies by appointing as counts people who maybe weren't even freemen, originally speaking, but that just by fighting and by heroic deeds into battle and all had gained the respect even of the king, and that could therefore reward them properly. So the service that was required to the Vassus, and in Francia was and eventually when everywhere it was exported by the Franks, was normally an armed service, as we were saying. The reward could be varied. I mean, initially speaking, this is something that you find even in non-Frankish world. Take the Huscarls of the Scandinavian world. A good reward was to be maintained as an individual, as a warrior, as a guard, as a Vassus, in fact, into the seigneurial home. So either in a court or, but eventually the whole thing shifted towards the assignation of a piece of land, of an estate of some extension, that was called beneficium. I mean, beneficium is a pretty standard term, but in practice, at this time in the Carolingian Empire, there wasn't a lot of money being used into transactions. Land was basically the only mean of payment at when at the higher level, let's say, at the higher levels, and obviously the Carolingians had structured this system by entrusting to their trustees pieces of lands that were first of all meant to be able to make the Vassi able to provide through the resources of that land the military service that was required to them. And that's the reason why before the Carolingian times you don't have that military mounted elite of such a strength, a cohesion and a training than the Carolingian one, because before there were cavalrymen, there were even very wealthy ones, but the society was much less structured into that fashion. It was much more of an individual based thing. Like there were many petty kings, or I don't know what, chieftains and all. In this sense, you can easily compare Carolingian society with, I don't know, the Saxon one, the Anglo-Saxon one. They were close to Francia and were definitely influenced even by the Frankish political practice, but that had a completely different society that did not imply feudalism and the large amount of land that every single vassal gained from the king, because the base was still sort of primitive, egalitarian, tribal one, into which the army was made up of mainly of, at least the core of the army was made up of a solid amount of infantrymen. Here the Franks invent basically the heavy medieval cavalry. The very important thing that I believe everybody knows, when at least if he has read the ABC of the Vassallatic-Beneficiary system, is that the land that the lord, where he was entrusted to his vassal, was not meant to remain in the vassal's hands, but it was still conceived as a private property of the seigneur. Remember when we were saying that Carolingians conceived, just like the Merovingians, the maybe slightly less, but substantially in the same way, the Frankish empire as a private dominion of the king and his family. Well, that was the concept. The king gave you land, but just to do something with that land, and when you died, theoretically, that, or at any other moment, at the king's will, that land could be claimed back by the king himself. So the political practice was much more different, because it's obvious and that the tendency was to retain that land, or maybe to pass this beneficium, this service, from father to son, which eventually happened. But this has always been, the kind of the problem of the feudal world, that theoretically the king was the only one entrusted, empowered to the point of claiming back that land, even if certain parts of lands eventually were juridically sanctioned as untouchable even by the kings, and owned full property by lord. At this early stage, the idea was that all the land that, Charlemagne or Louis the Pious entrusted had to eventually come back into the king's hands. But the political practice was different, essentially because there was no other way to eventually control that land. I mean, if you don't send someone physically to seize that land, first of all, because most of the land that was entrusted at this point was conquered land, not just beyond the borders of the empire, like in Saxony or in Italy or in Hungary, but also within the same borders of the older Merovingian Empire, in the sense that what had theoretically belonged to the Merovingians in origin had been seized by many other peoples during the many other local lords during the fragmentation of the Merovingians. So what the Carolingians did, and why they were so effective, was eventually to retake all this land back from those who had seized them, which meant to contemporarily wipe out basically the lords that had seized that. Some of these lords, some of the most powerful of these lords, were ecclesiastics, by the way. So it was also very ferocious ecclesiastical propaganda against Charles Martel for this reason. But you don't have to think, the ugly, violent, evil Carolingian knights arriving with the poor priest who is ploughing his poor land, and this guy's seizing it and doing ho 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 like that. No, the bishops were really like lords like any other, and there was absolutely no difference at all between bishops and other secular lords at this time in Gaul. They did exactly the same things, Also because practically there wasn't any law forbidding that, if not the one that the Franks in this sense had settled with the idea that certain goods belonged originally to the king. And this was a very clever way that allowed the Franks to expand and to consolidate the Carolingians to expand and to consolidate their power and to recreate the Frankish Empire. But at the same time, it immediately equated into having to find someone to hold these new lands. And obviously, it's true that the Carolingians had many concubines, many sons and all, but it's not that they could settle into this land just their familiars, their relatives, and also because, by the way, the Carolingian relatives didn't really love each other very much, just like the Merovingian ones. So the problem was evident that as soon as you conquered a land in a state that had basically no centralized administration, the only way was to basically reintrust that to another person who had to be evidently someone you had to trust. And trust, however, is something very relative in many ways, and eventually when the guy dies, it's even a problem to take that land back. And if you maybe just let the son of that vassal take in his place, then you fuel the idea that property belongs to the family and not to that family, and that therefore you keep increasing the private conceptions surrounding what they had to be theoretically public duties. At this time, the Franks tried, especially through the church, because the early Carolingians, as we were saying, kind of fought against ecclesiastical elites, or at least they imposed on them better their own policy. But eventually, in late Carolingian times, the ecclesiastical elites were basically the only bulwark that the Carolingian dynasty could hope at least, and they failed to use in order to stem the centrifugal push of the secular aristocracies that absolutely didn't want to participate to a public enterprise and preferred to conceive their beneficia as private properties. A process into which the church also, in this sense, highly benefited from, surely repaying with the interests the losses that they had previously, even though it wasn't really the church, it was still new Frankish aristocrats that really were drawn from the same families of the secular vassi in practice. So there was a social renewal also in that. There were different people. And they were mainly Frankish. They were usually there was a process of re-Frankization, we can say, of the lands that made up the empire, in the sense that in Aquitaine, in Alemannia, in Italy, in Saxony, eventually. So even those lands that already belonged to the empire before. So in Carolingian times, another injection of properly Frankish elements. In Italy, for instance, Italy was extremely important for the Carolingians. They sent the very best vassals in there. They were all coming from Picardy, those areas that to which the Frankish society had and aristocracy had its greater development. So in this sense, it's very interesting to track to trace to track the importance of the lands that made up the Carolingian Empire from a political, economical point of view, by seeing who the Carolingians sent there to rule. So the the beneficia were definitely enough to substantially feed the Vassi and the clienteles that they in turn were forming locally. So that the Vassi, as we have seen, began to become sort of a kind of a Frankish counts as sort of a class on its own that would have been eventually the base of low medieval European nobility, because eventually all these communists scattered all over Western and Central Europe became the ruling classes of the local lands when the Carolingian Empire collapsed. And they were considering themselves, we can say, as a class in the, you know, most neutral term of the world, in the sense that they recognized their social status, the fact that they all fought on horseback, that they had a common lifestyle, and also all things that were really really making part of an elite at that point that was ruling in the absence of any other centralized authority, and that therefore could and heavily interacted among each other, not just through fighting, but also through alliances, since there were so many different counts out there. It was a very complicated situation. If you look at the formation of the territorial dominions at this time, it's such a mess, and it's where all the messy fragmentation of political fragmentation of medieval Europe and eventually of modern Europe too actually took place, because it was something that's really started from the bottom. So there was from the above very few rational systematization of the whole of the political asset, even though the local seigneuries were pretty much logical in the way that they formed into the various spaces and times. Yeah, maybe this is all. I don't want to spend more than much on it again, because I will keep talking about Carolingian history, and I think that we'll have to tell these things all over and over again. So for now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I wanted to tell you that I mean, certain videos are probably much simpler when I talk about these political and social aspects, especially of early medieval Europe. Sometimes I don't know if I render really the idea of what I'm talking about, so I don't know if you find it interesting, if you find it confusing, if I'm able to express myself effectively. These are not very easy things to understand, and I wouldn't like to make them more complicated than they are. The reason for which I try to make more videos to even repeat certain concepts, so that there is a greater chance that Woolizens will kind of orientate himself better. But if you have any question, please feel free to ask, because these are very important. And also check out the Carolingian Europe playlist that I made, that surely contains already a substantial amount of videos relatively to these topics as well. So there's really a lot of, probably most of the questions that you have are already answered in there. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you want, so that you can receive notifications about my new contents. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye!